Lewis Hamilton looked like a front-row threat in Melbourne. Then Ferrari sent him into qualifying and somehow turned that into 7th on the grid. That is the contradiction sitting over Albert Park right now. A 7-time world champion joins the most watched team in Formula 1, finds instant speed in the first real weekend of a new rules era, then walks away from Saturday with a result that makes the whole car look slower than it really is. But here is what the paddock is not talking about. This was not a clean read on Ferrari at all, and the gap between appearance and reality is where this story starts. Ferrari had already shown enough to change how this weekend should be judged. Charles Leclerc topped first practice with a 1 minute 20.267, and Hamilton sat right behind him. Then in final practice, Hamilton was second with a 1 minute 19.669, and the only non-Mercedes driver close enough to keep George Russell honest. That is not the profile of a team scrambling for answers. That is the profile of a car with real one-lap speed, real balance, and a driver who suddenly looks fully alive again. The data tells a completely different story. Ferrari did not arrive in Melbourne hoping to survive. Ferrari arrived with a car that could attack, and that is where this story gets complicated, because if the SF26 had the pace to fight near the front, then P7 cannot be the full truth. Somewhere between that practice speed and the final qualifying result. 1. Ferrari lost control of the weekend, and Hamilton lost the grid spot his pace had already earned. That changes the whole meaning of Saturday. It changes how the field should read Ferrari, how Hamilton fans should read this comeback, and how every rival should read what might be coming next. To understand that, you have to start with the decision that quietly set the whole thing on fire. Ferrari did not lose this session when the clock hit 0. Ferrari put itself in danger the moment it chose to play qualifying differently from almost everyone else. While the rest of the field reached for the soft tire in Q1, Ferrari rolled both cars out on the medium and bet that the SF26 had enough raw speed to survive without using its best grip too early. On paper, it looked bold and clever. In reality, it turned the safest part of qualifying into a balancing act. What no broadcast covered is this. Actually, the gamble only worked if every part of the session stayed calm, and Melbourne gave Ferrari nothing calm at all. At first, the call almost looked brilliant. Hamilton fired in a 1 minute 19.811 on the medium and briefly went fastest, ahead of drivers using the softer compound, which told everyone watching that the underlying pace in the Ferrari was absolutely real. Leclerc was not as clean through the lap and ran wide at turn 3, which mattered because Q1 was already tightening around them. As the track improved and soft tire runners found more time, the Ferraris were pushed closer to the cut line than a front-running team ever wants to be. They survived in 6th and 7th, but surviving was never the goal, and that is where Ferrari created the problem it would spend the rest of qualifying trying to escape. Because once Hamilton scraped through that phase, the reward never really arrived. The medium tire call had saved nothing that mattered if it left him entering the next session without a clean tire picture, no rhythm, and no breathing room. Ferrari had chased efficiency, but the cost was control, and that is always dangerous in a session where the order can flip in seconds. The real story was never about the lap time. It was about what that decision took away from Hamilton before the most important runs even began. And once Q2 opened, the damage Ferrari had hidden in Q1 suddenly became impossible to miss. Friday did not hint at Ferrari being competitive. It pointed straight at it. From the first session of this new era, the car looked settled, responsive, and immediately comfortable around Albert Park. Leclerc opened the weekend fastest with a 1 minute 20.267 in FP1, and Hamilton sat right behind him, which instantly gave Ferrari the strongest early statement of any team. That alone would have been enough to raise eyebrows. But the shape of Hamilton's day mattered even more than the headline. He was not just quick once. He was quick again and again, across different runs, in a car that still should have been asking questions. That pattern carried into the rest of practice, and this is where Ferrari's case became much stronger than the final grid would later suggest. In FP2, Oscar Piastri went quickest with a 1 minute 20.050 as McLaren showed real speed. While Mercedes stepped forward through George Russell and Kimi Antonelli. Hamilton still finished 4th, and the gap to Russell was only 0.001 seconds, which is basically nothing in a session like that. Then came FP3, where Russell laid down a 1 minute 19.053, and Hamilton answered with a 1 minute 19.669, second fastest and the nearest non-Mercedes car. Nobody in that garage expected what came next, because when one driver stays inside the top group through FP1, FP2, and FP3, that usually tells a team it has a stable platform, not a fragile one. Hamilton was the only driver to remain inside the top 4 across the 2 Friday sessions, then backed it up again on Saturday morning, which gave Ferrari something far more valuable than one flashy lap. It gave them a real baseline. The car was working, the confidence was there, the speed had already shown itself in every important phase before qualifying began, which is why the next chapter matters so much. Because once Q2 started, Ferrari stopped looking like a team building toward the front and started looking like a team trying to rescue itself. Q2 was where Ferrari's qualifying gamble stopped looking aggressive and started looking expensive. Hamilton opened that session and suddenly found himself down in 16th, buried in the danger zone, with the weekend threatening to flip in a matter of seconds. That was the shock. A driver who had looked planted, fast, on, and fully connected to the car through practice was now fighting just to stay alive in qualifying. This is the part that changes everything. The problem was no longer whether the SF26 had speed. The problem was whether Ferrari had left Hamilton with enough tire life and enough session control to actually use that speed when the pressure hit hardest. The scramble that followed told the real story. Ted Kravitz revealed that Hamilton had only just squeezed through the first phase and Ferrari did not have the clean reset it needed, which meant Q2 became a recovery mission instead of a build toward the final shootout. Hamilton had to claw his way back with a lap good enough for 6th, but that rescue came at a price because every extra push drained more out of the run plan. By the time Q3 arrived, he was already compromised. She says then Ferrari asked him to back out of his first attempt to give Leclerc track position. His final lap was a 1 minute 19.478, and it left him 7th. That result looked poor until the numbers around it exposed how misleading it really was. Hamilton was only 0.003 seconds behind Lando Norris, which is so small it barely exists in real terms, and the spread from 3rd to 7th was only 0.175 seconds. That means this was never a collapse in raw pace. It was a qualifying sequence where Ferrari kept taking away Hamilton's margin until the final classification could no longer reflect what the car had shown earlier in the weekend. P7 was the visible outcome, but not the full truth, and once Hamilton started talking after the session, the whole picture shifted again. Lewis Hamilton did not walk away from qualifying sounding like a driver who believed Ferrari had found its limit. He sounded like a driver who knew the result had lied. After ending up 7th, he said the car was much better and Ferrari could have been 3rd, and that statement landed hard because it cut straight through the surface level reading of the session. Most drivers say things like that when they are trying to soften a bad Saturday. Hamilton did not sound like he was protecting anyone, he sounded certain, and when a driver with his experience says a result did not match the car, people inside the paddock listen very carefully. The reason that quote mattered is because the timing from the weekend gave it weight. Hamilton had already gone 2nd in final practice with a 1 minute 19.669, while George Russell's benchmark had been a 1 minute 19.053, which left a gap that still kept Ferrari in the top fight heading into qualifying. Then in Q3, after the tire trouble and the traffic management issues, Hamilton ended up on a 1 minute 19.478 and nearly a second off pole on paper. Even though the shape of the earlier sessions never suggested Ferrari belonged that far back. Martin Brundle had already said Ferrari looked strong on one lap, on long runs, and on reliability, and that view suddenly felt much more important than the grid itself. That is why Hamilton's comment changed the meaning of the whole weekend. It forced the conversation away from 7th place and back toward what Ferrari had actually shown when the car was allowed to run cleanly. This was no longer about whether Hamilton had underdelivered. It was about whether Ferrari had hidden a top 3 car behind one messy qualifying sequence. Once that idea takes hold, the grid starts to look very different because if the Saturday result was distorted, then the Sunday threat was still very real, and the long-run data was about to make that even clearer. The grid only told part of the story. The long-run data told the rest, and it painted Ferrari in a much stronger light than 7th place ever could. George Russell still looked like the reference, which was important because Mercedes had clearly arrived in Melbourne with a car that could control both qualifying and race pace. But behind that, the fight was not as simple as the order suggested. What no broadcast covered is this. Ferrari's real strength was starting to show over distance, where tire behavior, consistency, and clean rhythm matter more than one compromised lap in a knockout session. Russell's average on the hard tire was a 1 minute 23.714, over an 11-lap run, the fastest long-run number anyone produced. Hamilton's average on the same compound was a 1 minute 24.412, which sounds like a big gap until the rest of the field brings the picture into focus. Isaac Hadjar averaged a 1 minute 24.571 on mediums, slower than Hamilton despite having the softer tire. Oscar Piastri averaged a 1 minute 24.848 on softs, again behind the Ferrari on a more favorable compound. Ferrari's own program was not perfect, with traffic and yellow flags getting in the way, but even with that disruption, the shape of the pace was clear enough to matter. That is where the weekend started pointing toward a very different Sunday. Mercedes still had the cleanest overall package, but Ferrari looked much closer to the front than the final grid made it seem, and quite possibly ahead of both McLaren and Red Bull on equivalent race conditions. That matters because race pace changes the emotional temperature of a weekend. A car that qualifies lower than expected can still become a threat if it stays alive over a stint and keeps pressure on the cars ahead. And once the wider grid chaos enters the picture, Hamilton's path back into the fight starts to look far more real than anyone first assumed. Sunday was never going to be a normal recovery drive, because the entire shape of the grid had already been broken before the race even began. Max Verstappen was starting from the back after losing the rear on entry to turn 1 in Q1. Carlos Sainz had not even set a qualifying time, and Kimi Antonelli, a rookie, was suddenly on the front row for Mercedes in one of the most unpredictable season openers Formula 1 had seen in years. That alone changed the pressure around Hamilton's race. He was not just chasing cars ahead. He was stepping into a field where one mistake, one safety car, or one badly timed fight could blow the whole order open. The strategic picture made it even more tense. Tire degradation had looked low enough all weekend to push most teams toward a one-stop race, which usually means the easiest place to gain positions disappears before the lights even go out. That should have hurt Hamilton badly from 7th. Is because when the pit window becomes narrow and the compounds hold on longer than expected, track position starts to matter even more than raw speed. But Albert Park still offered one huge chance. The long run down into turn 1, mixed with the unknown behavior of these new 2026 cars in dirty air, meant no one could be certain the old rules about overtaking still applied. That left Ferrari in a strange but dangerous position. Hamilton did not need the whole race to collapse. He only needed enough movement ahead of him for the pace underneath him to finally matter. If Verstappen's charge from the back dragged more cars into unstable battles, if Antonelli felt the pressure of his first front row start, or if McLaren and Ferrari found themselves nose to tail through the opening phase, then the order could shift very quickly. The next question was the biggest one of all, because once all the noise was stripped away, Ferrari still had to answer whether Melbourne had exposed a weakness or quietly revealed a contender. Melbourne did not prove Ferrari was 7th fastest. It proved Ferrari had already built something far more serious than the final grid suggested. Across the whole weekend, the same pattern kept returning. Leclerc opened fast, Hamilton stayed near the front through every major practice session. The long run numbers kept Ferrari in the top group. And the gaps in qualifying were so tight that one compromise sequence changed the entire picture. That is the conclusion this weekend keeps dragging us toward. Ferrari did not arrive with a car that needed saving. Ferrari arrived with a car that was ready to fight, then failed to show its full hand when it mattered most. That should concern every team around them. Mercedes still looked like the cleanest package in Melbourne, with George Russell on pole and Kimi Antonelli, a rookie, alongside him, which gave them the strongest opening statement of the new era. McLaren still had real speed through Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. Red Bull still had the chaos factor of Verstappen charging from the back, and Isaac Hadjar had already shown enough to keep that garage in the conversation. But Ferrari's case was different. The SF26 kept producing evidence. Hamilton was second in FP3 with a 1 minute 19.669, finished just 0.003 seconds behind Norris in qualifying, and still carried race pace that held up against the field on less flattering tire conditions. So this weekend leaves Formula 1 with a much bigger story than one disappointing grid slot. It leaves the paddock looking at Hamilton and Ferrari as a pairing that already has the speed to disturb the order, even before the operation around that speed is fully sharpened. That is what makes Melbourne matter. Not because Ferrari got everything right, but because it got enough right to show what could happen once the Saturday execution catches up. P7 was the result people saw. The threat hiding underneath it was the part that really mattered.